Okay, great. Everyone, welcome to the panel. What is the revolutionary subject? We're going to introduce platypus, then read the prompts, and then introduce the speakers and go over the panel format. The Platypus Affiliate Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left, with possibilities of contemporary politics today. This is technically an event for Platypus NYU. Our reading group is stopped for the semester, but in spring we'll be picking up with weekly coffee breaks and weekly reading groups for anyone that's interested. Okay, so here's the panel prompt given to the panelists. During the last 25 years, the millennial left raised a variety of historical forms for organizing revolutionary politics. The sectarian Marxism, anti-imperialism, the Iraq war protests, the turn to the 99%, and anarchism of Occupy Wall Street, and the recent neo-social democracy with its invocation of second international socialist parties. Today, these various attempts to change the world have been eclipsed by the transformation coming from the right represented by Donald Trump. In light of the exhaustion of these various strategies, it seems an opportune moment to return to some fundamental questions about the role of the left. Historically, the left was the critical consciousness of the class able to change the world. Following György Lukács, consciousness was a necessary precondition of revolution. Only when the consciousness of the proletariat is able to point out the road along which the dialectics of history is objectively impelled, but which it cannot travel unaided, will the consciousness of the proletariat awaken to the consciousness of the process, and only then will the proletariat become the identical subject-object of history as praxis will change reality. Keeping this history in mind, Platypus poses the following questions to the panelists. What is the crisis of society? How should the left orient towards the present crisis? How does the left organize discontent with capitalism? What is the role of organization for the left? How should we relate to historical forms of organization, including party and class? Is there a working class today? If so, what is the working class? How is class different from the 99% or the people? What is the relationship between a class in itself and a class for itself? Finally, what is the revolutionary subject? How is Marxism bound up with the critique of this subject? How do we stand in relation to the Marxist idea of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Okay, now I will briefly introduce the panelists in order for speaking. Andrew Arato was born in Budapest in 1944 and received a PhD from the University of Chicago in 1975. He has been professor at the New School since 1981. He is the author or co-author of, among other books, Young Lukács and the Origins of Western Marxism, Civil Society, Political Theory, Adventures in Constituent Power, and most recently, Populism, Civil Society, A Challenge to Constitutional Democracy. John Garvey has been active in radical politics for more than 50 years. In the mid-90s, he was a founding editor of Race Trader. In 2010, or thereabouts, he was a founding editor of Insurgent Notes. Since 2016, he has been a member of the editorial group of Hard Crackers. He also edited with David Brandy in the long 60s, Conversations with the Lifelong Revolutionary, Born Golden, which was published earlier this year. Alex Steinberg is an independent scholar who has taught and published on topics ranging from Hegel's philosophy of history, Marxism and humanism, language, dialectics, nature, and the crisis in physics and dialectical philosophy. Alex chose not to continue his postgraduate work in the New School for Social Research when he became active in the anti-Vietnam War and socialist movement. Before joining the Marxist Education Project, Alex taught classes at its predecessor organization, the Direct Forum, and at the New Space for Anti-Capitalist Research. Alex has been a presenter at the Socialist Scholars Conference, the Left Forum, and Historical Materialism. And finally, Ross Wolfe. Ross Wolfe is a writer and teacher living in New York and a member of the Independent Labor Club. Okay, so the format of the panel, we will start with opening remarks. Each panelist will have 10 to 12 minutes to present, and then we will have time for responses. So each panelist will have 5 minutes to respond to any of the other opening remarks that they choose, and we'll open for Q&A. So, Andrew, if you would like to begin.
Yeah, thank you. So we have 12 minutes, and I'm watching the time carefully. There is an outline which I can share with all of you.
Oh, you have 10 minutes now. 12 minutes now.
Okay, 10 minutes now. Okay, good. So here is the issue. Why are we concerned with the issue of revolutionary subject or the subject of transformation? And I think that the concern about 100 years ago or even more, when first György Lukács, then others like Porsche, especially Gramsci, have used this concept, which I don't think that you will find in Marx or Engels directly. But the reason for introducing the concept was the transformation of the socialist movement, social democracy, and what were taken by these authors to be deterministic expectations of historical change, which they had doubts about, and I wanted to, in some ways, remedy. I think that the most important impulse here is given by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, because he introduces the subjective factor. I don't believe he has called it that. The role of organization, the role of a political party in the transformation, and he was himself critical of the deterministic arguments, which were prevalent all over Europe at the time. I think all of you know that this move by Lenin, first followed significantly by Lukács, Porsche, and Gramsci, involved much greater flexibility, because once a subjective factor becomes so important, you don't have to wait until the full development of objective factors, sociological factors in the development of the working class are fulfilled. There can be intervention at different stages, and certainly the Russian Revolution seems to indicate it. I just know that Trotsky had doubts about this idea from the outset, but I think the most important doubts emerge with Lenin's new economic policy, represented most by Karin, and I think just in order to see how contemporary this is, I think that Deng Xiaoping's reform in China fits into that kind of logic. In other words, you cannot skip the historical stage of capitalist development to organization, even through consciousness. And this idea, which of course the Stalinists thoroughly negated in Russia, we would just revive in China recently. Now, of course, the question is, once you change the theory to that kind of extent, doesn't mean that the subject changes. In my work, I have represented the idea that the subject now, and it was already during a new economic policy in Russia, a new kind of subject, not the working class, but the organized entities beneath society, which has been called civil society. Gramsci, the one who insisted on using this particular term. So reliance on or rebuilding of civil society became the central terrain of seeking subjectivity, and there has been success in some places, but certainly not success from the point of view of the Marxian classics that would not have considered either the new economic policy as it was, and certainly not Deng Xiaoping's reform as the revolution that they have sought. So what about that relationship? What about the future after a term has been taken from the working class as subject to civil society? I'm watching my time, but my first point in this context will be that inevitably the place of the state or the state nation or the territorial state, in the case of China Empire, in fact, has become relevant to theories of transformation. Theorists could reject the idea of socialism in one country, but in any case, in one country has become the terrain of transformations. The dialectic was only Russia, of course. Deng Xiaoping's reform is only China. But if you add other examples like Cowderism in Hungary, the Czech Spring, within the period of solidarity, you see that the unit becomes to an important extent the territorial state. Does this mean we go back to Hegel and replace class by nation as the subject? Not necessarily, but one has to change the meaning of subjectivity in the process. What I would stress, given my own work, is that this shift to the level of a nation implies two things. One, that the topic of constitution becomes significant, namely designing and redesigning the national political order becomes a fundamental problem. But corresponding to this, and perhaps contrary to this, the level of internationalism has to be reintroduced once again. Now, as to constitution making, yes, that occurs within national units on the whole. I would not consider even to make a European Union to be equivalent on the level of the design of national constitutions. The problem, though, is that the history of constitutionalism doesn't give us too many clues about how this process is supposed to end. The two classical countries, United States and France, are both problematic from this point of view. The U.S., because constitutionalism has become most of the time a conservative and defensist ideology, and that's in spite of Thomas Jefferson's idea that it should be renewed every generation once. That clearly has not happened in the United States. And France, where it has happened, the result was at least 3 times a dictatorship. So both of the great constitutional traditions are problematic, and we might have to look to a different one. I personally would single out South Africa as the model case from which we could all learn. But even if you learn that, the problem is, and I want to end with this, that even when institutional design works through a dramatically democratic pattern, creating democratic institutions, evolving to many forms of popular participation, democracy in one country is not ultimately possible. Tusky would be proud of me for making this turn in the argument. Obviously, socialism in one country was not possible for him. But I would say democracy in one country is also not possible because of the challenge of globalization. In other words, every democracy, including the South African one, and one can trace this for a lot of places, is put under a lot of pressure by international institutions, non-majoritarian institutions, as we now call them, non-democratic institutions, and very often involving capitalist interest. The tension between capitalism and democracy, which Marx was right to insist on, and I think our whole tradition, all our left-wing traditions insist on it, remains a tension that cannot be solved on a nation-state level. So I would say the strategy should be a two-step one: reconstitution on a national level and international agreements and proposals on the international level. I would say the United States is due for a constitutional moment, given what we're going through at the moment. We have had them in the past. I think in this respect, Bruce Ackerman, Jack Balkin, probably even Hannah Arendt were right. U.S. had constitutional moments, but I think we need one now. But this will not end the problem, because democracy in one country will not be possible even here. And so the turn to the international level, which is not that, of course, an international revolution, but rather an international political process, would be necessary if we want to take democracy seriously. Thank you very much.
Hi. So, oh, I'm sorry. He did ask me to do that. Hello. Can you hear me? Yes? I always forget to hold this close to my mouth. I want to thank the Platypus folks at NYU for inviting me to speak today. I kind of joked with Ross is that over the course of the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, this is my 3rd invitation by Platypus, okay? I feel like it's my top agent for kind of inviting me. What is the crisis of society? I confess that I was a bit, not confused, but not completely kind of comfortable with the language of the crisis of society, but hopefully I've managed to do justice to some extent. So increasingly, to state perhaps what is almost obvious, the crisis that surrounds us is a total crisis. It affects all aspects of human life and well-being: income, health, education, children, youth, the elderly, the shelter that people have, the security they have, the hopefulness they have. Probably even it affects, certainly it affects their lifespans, either through an acceleration of natural kinds of misfortunes or ones that are socially induced, like the opioid kind of epidemic and things of that sort. At the same time, of course, it is a crisis on a grand scale, affecting the climate, the environment, even I think the very future of human existence. I don't know how many people watched I guess it was the House of Dynamite movie that was on a month or so ago about what it would look like were a nuclear accident or an armed nuclear accident take place. And it brought back, there was a time when in the 60s that the possibility of nuclear destruction was on everyone's mind, and I think amongst many other things we've become somewhat amnesiac about what might be, what the terror surrounding us is. So leaving that aside for the moment, I wanted to begin by talking mostly about something my friend Dave Ranney wrote some time ago about his understanding of fictitious value, fictitious capital, and his work, and by extension what I'm doing, draws extensively on the writings of Lauren Goldner, who I work with closely for maybe 15 years or more. And Ross will perhaps have something more to say about Lauren. So capital's efforts to, and I am going to read this part, to manage the consequences of the overaccumulation of capital, meaning that it has too much money that cannot be profitably invested in productive activities that could yield surplus value. This line of thought depends on a basic Marxist category that human labor and capital produces both use value in the form of objects of one sort or another that can be used for a variety of purposes, good, bad, and worthless, and exchange value, which enables products to be exchanged at the same value as products made by others. Rest assured, value is not the same as material wealth, but within capital, in its money form, it serves as the wealth equivalent and the only means for purchasing the needs of life. When value is no longer being produced, people do not have the means to secure their reproduction from one day to the next or one generation to the next. Fictitious value serves as a substitute for real value. It represents an enormous amount of value in anticipation of becoming real, with no guarantee that it will. In the meantime, like all value, it seeks out opportunities to expand, and it does so by finding ever more places to expand without expanding value, without expanding, in other words, the life needs, without the products that are needed to sustain life and into the future. And where it goes to real estate, stocks, bonds, commodity speculations, corporate takeovers, anything that promises a proverbial fast buck. It also serves to keep more people alive, but it does so in a curious way, expanding voracious consumption at the top and marginal survival at the bottom. For Uber drivers, delivery workers, back of the restaurant workers, and others in far more extreme and desperate circumstances. This model then becomes replicated across the socio-economic order, as the high-end capital generates and feeds on rapid-fire algorithms and at the bottom generates and feeds on endless hours of painful drudgery by those who ride through traffic and wade through piles of garbage, data included. There is no need to invoke an overly simplified base superstructure model to appreciate that within capital there is a profound structuring relationship between fundamental economic processes and the rest of social reality. This is not all that there is, but it is a lot. And now I'm going to close by quoting Engels, because I have forsworn using Marx, I think. This is Engels. According to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. Other than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if anybody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit, constitutions established by the victorious class after a battle, juridical forms, even the reflexes of all those actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development in dogmas also exercise their influence upon the course of historical struggles, and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. There is an interaction of all these elements in which, amidst all the endless host of accidents, that is of things and events whose interconnection is so remote or impossible to prove that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary. Otherwise, the application of the theory to any period of history would be easier than the solution of a simple equation of the first degree. I hope that my reading was not too quick or too dense, but I would suggest that in terms of understanding and appreciating and perhaps rising to the occasion posed by the crisis of society, keeping in mind both the sort of laying of the ground for that by the kind of preponderance and centrality of fictitious value, and simultaneously keeping in mind the extraordinary complexity of the ways in which life and death unfolds would be very helpful and necessary. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to thank Platypus for inviting me to this panel. And before I begin, let me just preface that I tried to touch on pretty much most of the themes that were in the prompt for this panel. And much of it is going to be a superficial kind of treatment due to the time constraints, and that's just the way it is. So here we go. There was a time when the mainstream media in the US didn't even use the phrase working class. This was in the period of the post-war boom, what Daniel Bell in the 1950s termed the end of ideology. This kind of what we may call post-class ideology was given a new lease on life for a while after the fall of the Soviet Union and Francis Fukuyama's conception that we are at the end of history, that class conflict and war has been overcome with the final triumph of liberalism and democracy. Yet here we are some 35 years after Fukuyama and 70 years after Daniel Bell, and we have seen not only the disintegration of those narratives about the end of classes and ideologies, but even the New York Times now openly talks about the working class and class conflict. Conversely, members of the ruling class, which in previous decades shunned publicity, are now out in the open, parading their wealth and power and corruption shamelessly. And social inequality has reached levels unheard of in previous epochs. Not only is class society back, but we have a more or less open oligarchy controlling all the levers of power of the state, a state which is increasingly authoritarian, basing its legitimacy on an 18th century constitution that justifies the shedding of democratic rights rather than protecting them. Of course, the working class today does not look like the working class of the 1930s or 1960s. I don't think I have to list those differences: the rise of a proletarianized and precarious labor force that were previously secure middle-class professionals, the destruction of blue-collar jobs, and now the threat of AI replacing white-collar jobs previously thought irreplaceable. Then there is the economic crisis resulting from an ever-spiraling mountain of debt. We have inflation, which is already bad, but getting much worse due to tariffs, vast cuts to whatever is left of the social safety net, healthcare, social security, removal of workplace safety standards, environmental regulations, etc. What we are seeing is the growth of a huge army of an angry working class. So far as we saw with the election of Trump and internationally with the rise of the far right and the revival of fascism, it is the right that has managed to take advantage of this army of discontent. Yet this is clearly also a huge opportunity for the left. What I mean by left is, first of all, a political movement whose goal is minimally to see conditions improve for the working class, the poor, minorities of all stripes, as well as immigrants. This further implies that if you are of the left, you are participating in actions that contribute to the building of an ongoing organization that can take forward a collective political and economic struggle to achieve those ends. And that collection of individuals is not an arbitrary one that happens to coalesce around certain issues, but is the expression of the interests of the working class. For it cannot be otherwise in a society divided into classes. Of course, there are many other divisions in society and many other groups of individuals who coalesce around those divisions, such as feminists, the LGBT community, advocates for racial justice, etc., each with their own interests which should not be ignored. But the division into classes is the most fundamental because it affects everyone regardless of other interests, and the liberation of other oppressed groups is not possible without moving forward the struggle of the working class. A couple of other things. What form of organization is needed that sustains that struggle over the long term? It must be an organization that develops a program and policies that concretizes the interests of the working class and all the oppressed in a common struggle. And such an organization is a party. Nor do we have to start from scratch in theorizing such a party. We have at our disposal the history of the socialist movement. Those who ignore that history will inevitably fail. I know that those of you who have some positive thoughts about Occupy Wall Street will disagree. That movement, which was under the influence of anarchists, took pride in not having a program and avoiding the creation of any ongoing political organization. I was present at many of the conclaves in Zuccotti Park in 2011, and I interviewed several of the participants in my capacity as a journalist. I can say that while I was enormously impressed by the energy and commitment of the mostly young people there, many of them working class youth, I was not impressed by their leadership. Yes, there was a leadership present, even though officially there were no leaders and no followers. The effectiveness of Occupy must be gauged objectively by what it actually achieved. Yes, there was a huge burst of enthusiasm, and a strong message against capitalism was broadcast throughout the world and energized many others. But in the end, not much was left after the participants were evicted from Zuccotti Park. The story of Zuccotti Park is pretty much the story of every such protest movement of the last 50 years. It had in common with such events as the gigantic student protests against the Vietnam War, the anti-nukes movement of the 1980s, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, and in more recent years, and many, many others in between that I don't even remember anymore. There is an initial huge burst of enthusiasm in challenging the status quo or demonstrating against a terrible injustice, which gains the support of millions practically overnight. What happens is that those movements, if they do not get co-opted into one or more so-called progressive NGOs that are another tool of the status quo, simply disappear as fast as they appeared on the scene. So the conclusion from this look at some recent and not so recent historical examples is that if you are going to be a serious leftist that will present a genuine challenge to the status quo, you need to be in or work for the creation of a political party that programmatically expresses the interests of the working class and the oppressed, and that is completely independent of the political arms of the capitalist class, which in the United States means the Republican and Democratic parties. How is that to be done is, of course, the question of our time. I'm not going to try to answer that either in this presentation. The next question to consider is what kind of political party is required for our time in the 21st century? And this allows me to segue into another question posed in this panel, the rise of the so-called neo-social democratic parties in recent years. This applies to a party such as Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and the DSA in the US. These groups prided themselves on their freedom from the dogma of the old left, while espousing a radical program that was a dramatic departure from the right-wing pro-capitalist parties of the old socialist parties, such as PASOK in Greece, or the Socialist Party in Spain, or in this case, the Democratic Party in the US, since we don't really have a socialist party. I will provide two examples with which I am acquainted to make a point about the nature of these parties. One took place 10 years ago in Greece, and that was the betrayal of the referendum by Syriza. I was present in Greece in the summer of 2015, when those fateful events took place. I participated in many of the rallies leading up to the referendum. I heard Prime Minister and head of Syriza, Alex Tsipras, address a crowd of over 1 million in Syntagma Square on the eve of the referendum. I returned to Syntagma Square the following Sunday evening for the celebration after the results of the referendum were announced, when a landslide of 61% of those voting said "ochi," which is the Greek word for no, to the austerity demands being imposed by the European Union on Greece. And that figure doesn't tell the full story. The vote was clearly along class lines. In many working class neighborhoods, the no vote was over 80%, while in some of the trendy upper and middle class neighborhoods, the vote was the exact opposite, 80% or more for yes. Among those celebrating that evening, I saw Zoe Konstantopoulou, the chair of the Hellenic Parliament and one of the most militant and consistent Syriza voices against the EU-imposed austerity. She was positively beaming with delight. Little did she suspect that at that very moment her Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, was about to violate and betray the wishes of the Greek working class and initiate an abject surrender to the demands of the EU bankers. Tsipras announced his decision to toss aside the verdict of the referendum the very next morning, and shortly thereafter, the finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, resigned. Many were shocked by this sudden turnaround, but to anyone who had been following Tsipras and Syriza's political history, the betrayal of the referendum was to be expected, if not the suddenness of that betrayal. What lesson can we draw from the event that, in retrospect, sets the stage for a decade of demoralization of the left? One obvious thing to note is that Syriza was never as radical as it sounded, and its program was from the beginning an attempt to compromise both with the predatory EU and the native Greek capitalist class. The problem was that the EU and Greek capitalism did not give Syriza any option for a compromise. So Syriza was left with the alternative of either complete surrender or complete break with capitalism and a turn to socialism. Some in Syriza thought there was a third alternative, a break with the EU that consisted of a revival of Greek capitalism based on the old drachma currency. This was, in my opinion, a chimera that I discussed in an article I wrote at the time called Plan C, the Socialist Alternative for Greece, available in this book. So Syriza was compromised from the beginning by an opportunist outlook that made a consistent struggle against the EU-imposed austerity impossible. That point has been made by many others as well. But there is something else to be said about Syriza that has not been so well understood, and that was that, organizationally speaking, what was Syriza? It was not a traditional political party with dues-paying members and chapters throughout the country that elected their regional representatives, etc. It had a much looser structure. Having begun as a coalition of several radical left groups, it was initially a party of committed militants, but by 2012, when its electoral status dramatically rose as that of PASOK collapsed, it was transformed, as Stathis Kouvalakis, a leader of the left platform of Syriza, explained, through a process leading more to a party of followers rather than a party of activists. The upshot of this form of organization was that the leadership could not be held accountable by the membership. There was no organizational constraint holding back Tsipras from announcing his decision to ignore the results of the referendum, despite the strong feelings of the overwhelming majority of Syriza's members and supporters. Now, how does this translate to a more recent event, the election of Zoran Mamdani as mayor of New York? There is no question that Mamdani's dramatic victory, first in a Democratic primary and then in a general election, was a momentous historical event in American politics. It was highly significant that Mamdani campaigned as a democratic socialist, championed a litany of reforms that were, by American standards, extremely radical, such as free buses, city-owned grocery stores, etc. He also refused to budge, at least for a while, from a strong criticism of Israel and the horrendous slaughter in Gaza. The fact that his campaign enlisted over 100,000 volunteers is unprecedented in local politics, not only in New York, but anywhere in the U.S. But even before the election, Mamdani signaled that he was ready to make his peace with the Democratic Party establishment and the billionaires of Wall Street and the real estate moguls of New York. And since the election, we saw Mamdani handpick a staff with connections to the city power brokers, all veterans of previous administrations. Finally, we saw Mamdani with a friendly conclave with Trump at the White House. What all this shows is that Mamdani does not see himself as accountable to his constituents. The DSA, while it is in name a membership organization, is first of all not a political party at all. Its membership is mostly inactive and has little influence in the decisions which are left to a tiny handful of officers in its leadership. So there is no organizational pressure from Mamdani, either from the Democratic Party or the DSA, to be held accountable for its decisions. What can we say then about what the proper attitude should be of those on the left who recognize the importance of Mamdani's election victory as opening up opportunities for a genuine working-class political party to arise? I will give two examples of what the wrong approach should be. The first is from a group called Socialist Action, and I quote, "Mamdani is yet another less evil capitalist politician selected and supported by the super-rich at a time when crisis-ridden Democrats and U.S. capitalism itself are torn between more overt fascist-type repression advocated by Trump and a more mild version of the same policies meekly suggested by Democrats." Yes, it is true that Mamdani ran as a Democrat.
Do you mind, we're a bit over time.
Give me 2 more minutes. It is true that Mamdani ran as a Democrat, and a principled socialist should never support him or any Democrat. But is it also true that his election represented nothing new, that it is just more or less the same left or evil politics, nothing to get excited about? What about the 100,000 volunteers his campaign enlisted? What about Mamdani raising the word socialist in his campaign? Nothing new there? This is a perfect example of sectarian obsessionist politics that thinks all that is important is having the correct opinion. Whether you can reach the masses of people with your opinion is of no importance to such people. It is not even recognized as a problem. From the other side of the political spectrum, we get another example of how not to approach the Mamdani election victory. In an article on Jacobin, the unofficial arm of the right wing of the DSA, author Lisa Featherston actually comes out attacking those who want to hold Mamdani accountable. She writes, New York DSA, whose organization played a key role in Mamdani's victory, wasted no time in launching this campaign, Tax the Rich. Isn't about the left holding Mamdani accountable, a strategic position that would befit an organization that saw itself outside of the Mamdani project. So a mature left, according to Featherstone, would claim responsibility from the ownership of Mamdani's victory and under no circumstances would try to hold him accountable. It's hardly necessary to comment on such an unprincipled position, which shows very clearly where the dominant force in the DSA is headed. So what would be the approach, the correct approach in the case of Mamdani election victory? Interestingly enough, I find myself in agreement on this question with the Spartacist League, a group which I usually strongly disagree. Their position is that serious socialists should try to have a dialogue with those DSA members who supported Mamdani and convince them to hold Mamdani accountable for the promises he made to them. That opens a path for those forces that were drawn to Mamdani to learn from their own experience the shortcomings of Mamdani and the entire enterprise of attempting to build a movement for socialism within the Democratic Party. Obviously, there are many issues of strategy and tactics, not to mention mass psychology, involved in such an approach. This will not take us immediately to the point where the working class in itself becomes the working class for itself, not to mention the dictatorship of the proletariat in which the working class is in and for itself, but it will take us a step further on the road to class consciousness. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm just going to hop into my remarks in the interest of time. So since Kant, the subject designates that which is thrown beneath the onrush of experience, while the object designates that which is turned over against the subject. Consciousness, will, and intentionality belong to the subject, just as quality, quantity, and measure belong to the object. The object is known and acted upon by the subject. The subject, for its part, reflects on itself and its own conditions of experience. Some ambiguity necessarily persists as to whether the subject is an individual or collective entity. For Hegel, Geist stood for substantial subjectivity. At times it was embodied by world historic individuals, as in the case of Napoleon, while at other times it was borne by entire nations. Hegel further identified the state bureaucracy of salaried, educated civil servants as the universal class, whose particular interests are the same as those of society as a whole. Karl Marx criticized this identification at length in his youthful critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. He saw another social class as the potential bearer of such universality, the proletariat. In Marx's view, labor stood for the subjective aspect of modern industry. But the proletarianized working class had its essence alienated from it in the capitalist process of production, objectified in things of its own making. Only through a conscious, practical intervention into history, through the socialization of society, could the antithesis of subject and object finally be transcended. This was not just a shortcoming of Hegelian idealism either. Settling accounts with the materialist outlook of Feuerbach, Marx wrote that, quote, "The chief defect of all previous materialism is that things, reality, sensuousness are conceived only in the form of the object, of contemplation, not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively." Marx never abandoned this fundamental position. Although the focus of his critique drifted over the years from philosophy to politics to economics, this is more of a change in emphasis than a wholesale rupture. Even in Capital, this vocabulary is attainment. Quote, "The rule of the capitalist over the worker is the rule of things over man, of dead labor over the living, of the product over the producer. At the level of material production, of the life process in the realm of the social, you find the inversion of subject and object into object and vice versa. What we are confronted by here is the alienation of man from his own labor." End quote. Under capitalism, everything is turned on its head. Proletarian revolution would flip this topsy-turvy world upside down, placing it back on its feet. This could occur solely through the self-assertion of the proletariat, or as the rules of the First International stated, quote, "The emancipation of the working classes, object, must be conquered by the working classes, subject, themselves." To do so, the proletariat would have to attain a kind of reflexive awareness usually associated with subjectivity. Marx thought that it was necessary to, quote, "to make the already deep rift between labor and capital even wider, to produce that concentrated, conscious space hatred that is usually the surest guarantee of socialist revolution," end quote. In order to set free the elements of the new society of which old, collapsing bourgeois societies excelled pregnant, he wrote in 1871, the workers would have to proceed, quote, "in full consciousness of their historic mission," end quote. Following the death of his lifelong collaborator Engels in 1895, Marx's revolutionary followers continued to stress the necessity of class consciousness in the struggle for socialism. Rosa Luxemburg, in her polemic against Princescheinian revisionism, called the proletariat, quote, "subjective factor of socialist transformation," end quote. Leonid Trotsky, a few years later, reflected on, quote, "the subjective conditions, the preparedness of the proletariat for a socialist revolution. It's not sufficient that the standard of technique has rendered socialist economy advantageous from the point of view of the productivity of social labor. It's not sufficient either that social differentiation based on this technique has created a proletariat which is the main class by virtue of its numbers and its economic role, and which is objectively interested in socialism. It's further necessary that the class be conscious of its objective interests. It's necessary that it understand that there's no way out for it except through socialism. It's necessary that it combine into an army strong enough to conquer political power in open battle," end quote. In other words, there must be a confluence of the subjective and objective sides of history. For this to happen, workers must first organize themselves on an independent basis. Once they've achieved a certain level of self-organization, they've traditionally articulated their demands through the political medium of a party, which serves as a repository of historical consciousness. According to Marxist theory, the working class can only carry out its revolutionary tasks if it then seizes state power and rules in its own name, through dictatorship of the proletariat. Vladimir Lenin saw this clearer than anyone else. In his conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic, departing from his earlier epistemology of reflection, He noted that, quote, man's consciousness not only reflects the objective world, but creates it, end quote. Lenin thus highlighted the active role played by workers in any social revolution in unmistakably subjective terms, quote, revolutions are made by the class consciousness, will, passion, and imagination of tens of millions, spurred on by a most acute struggle of classes. It was above all György Lukács who theorized the proletariat as both the subject and object of history. Writing at the high tide of the revolutionary sequence of 1917 to 1923, he argued that, quote, man must become conscious of himself as a social being, as simultaneously the subject and object of the socio-historical process, end quote. Hence the excerpt quoted at the outset of the panel description, which is worth reiterating, quote, only when the consciousness of the proletariat is able to point out the road along which dialectics of history is objectively impelled, but which it cannot travel unaided, will the proletariat become the identical subject-object of history whose praxis will change reality, end quote. With the failure of the world revolution, however, this recognition receded. Critical theory sought to preserve this insight over the next few decades, even as Lukács himself tried to bury it. Max Horkheimer, for example, wrote that at present, quote, society, though made up of individuals, is an active subject, even if a non-conscious one, and, to that extent, a subject only in an improper sense, unquote. He nevertheless clung to the idea of an eventual transition from the present form of society to a future one where mankind will for the first time be a conscious subject and actively determine its own way of life. Theodor Adorno, Horkheimer's co-thinker, stated 20 years later that, quote, mankind does not really qualify as the subject of history. There is really no such subject at present, only the traces of its blood, end quote. Despite his emphasis on the primacy of the object, though, Adorno was partly looking to dispense with the concept of the subject. Not everyone looked to salvage subjectivity, of course. Even putative Marxists like Louis Althusser came to regard history as a process without a subject, filled with contingency. Under the influence of Heidegger's fundamental ontology and Saussurean structuralism, post-war French theorists and their Anglophone epigonies attempted to dethrone the sovereign subject, which they felt undergirded Western metaphysics. Those who held on to the notion of the subject invariably pluralized it in the endless multiplication of subject positions. Rather than a potentially free, that is, spontaneous and autonomous cause of a fresh chain of events, subjects were merely the effect of the web of power conditions, always already interpolated. There was a political corollary to all this. Looking to fill the vacancy left by the proletariat, activists went shopping for new agents of social change, students, racial and sexual minorities, the third world, or some coalition thereof. Meanwhile, there was no shortage of proposed alternatives raised by famous academics, ranging from Laclau's People, Hart and Negri's Multitude, to Rancière's Uncounted. All these figures were intended to replace the God that failed. They symbolized irreducible complexity in different forms of what they called subjectivation. Lauren Goldner was right to suspect that, quote, behind these all-too-facile attacks on master narratives, the capitalists and their ideologues, the theoreticians of difference, were after the real game of the unitary working-class subject, end quote. More intriguing was Moïse Faustone's suggestion, grounded in certain crude passages from Marx, the capital was in fact the self-moving substance and automatic subject of society, albeit in an unconscious one, hence reversing Lukács. It's perhaps no accident Lukács would point to the proletariat as the subject of history at the crest of a wave of world revolutionary struggle, and that Faustone will point to capital as the subject of history once that wave crashed. When he published Time, Labor, and Social Domination in 1993, the grand social experiment launched in 1917 had definitively come to a close, and very little proletarian subjectivity plausibly remained. Here again, Goldner was close to the mark here. Capital is Hegel's spirit, he wrote in 1978, totality apparently rooted by itself. The word apparently is crucial to his conception. Goldner went on, quote, Marxist capital is nothing other than the phenomenology of the labor power coming to its concept, discovering itself as the unconscious mover at a seemingly autonomous world. The world of capital is the inverted world described by Hegel, end quote. Incidentally, this is not that far from what Faustone himself had written a few years earlier in 1974, quote, the proletariat as class in general is an historically specific category of alienation that should not be grasped as subject but as the not yet subject. That which constitutes the alienated subject capital and which becomes the subject by overthrowing capital and in the process abolishing that labor essential to capital which defines the proletariat itself." End quote. Presently, capital is the social subject determining our historical trajectory in Act II. Yet the proletariat remains the social subject in potentia, the only group capable of mastering the totality of relations generated by its own activity and giving it deliberate direction. Or, as Marx put it in his rough draft of Capita, quote, "The objective conditions of living labor appear as separate, independent values opposite living labor capacity, as a subjective being standing over against it, values belonging to an alien subject, confronting this living labor capacity," end quote. More than 100 years ago, the proletariat seemed poised to overthrow this alien subject and become, as the Internationale would have it, the human race. But the foretold transformation did not come to pass. The qualitative leap that would change the world did not occur, Adorno lamented, and the proletariat failed to constitute itself as the subject-object of history, as it was supposed to, according to Marx's own period, end quote. We're still living with the consequences of this failure. Here are Lukács's words, which follow the snippet from the panel description, sound particularly prophetic. Quote, "If the proletariat fails to take this step to become the simultaneous subject-object, the contradiction between subject and object will remain unresolved, will be reproduced by the dialectical mechanics of history at a higher level, in an altered form and with increased intensity," end quote. This is where things currently stand, as the antithesis seems more intractable now than ever before. Is there a working class today? Even if the proletariat no longer exists for itself, self-consciously, it nevertheless persists in itself as an ineliminable remainder, insofar as capital requires the mediation of labor in order to expand the amount of value invested in the productive process. As a class, it continues to exist objectively as a relation to the means of production. Yet there's another sense in which, absent its self-conscious subjectivity, the proletariat loses much of its substance. In the absence of a workers' movement aiming at its own self-emancipation, today it is so much exploitable material, a pool of labor to be soaked up by capital. Marx once told Engels that the working class is revolutionary or it is nothing. For some time now, we must admit, it has been nothing. Everything depends on it becoming something once again.
Okay, great. Now we'll have 5 minutes from each of the panelists for responses. Starting with you, Andrew.
What's the response to what the others have said?
5 minutes.
We have no response. They make me feel as if I were in a time warp. And that's nice. I mean, we're old people. I'm older than they are. But old people are in a time warp, and they kind of remember things from another stage of their lives. Our problems today cannot be solved by rediscovering the working class as it was in the 19th century, or even the early 20th. So I would say that it's important to actually figure out something new. I mean, I have tried to do that to the concept of civil society, which of course includes workers too, but includes many other forms of life, many other forms of association, many other possible initiatives. I think some people are convinced by it, some people are not. But in any case, I think that going back to formulas of 100 years ago should be resisted. I don't see the audience. I don't know if they're all young. I see one person who's certainly young. I do not speak of the panel. I'm much more interested in hearing what the audience thinks of this type of analysis, this type of language, than my views. The fact that I would resist, that's obvious. But what do they think? I mean, do they think that the politics of the classical working class can be revived? What is it sociologically, the subject that they are focusing on? One, in the context of contemporary complexity, the difficult forms of social stratification, and all the rest. makes anyone think that one sociological entity could play the role that Marx had good reason to believe, because the tendency was in his direction there. On some level, Lenin still could think this way, even though he was very much in a peasant country. But at least he was neighbor to countries where proletarian trade became very, very important. But I think that's pretty much the last time. With the defeat of the workers' movement in the 1930s, I think return to that past has become impossible. And I hope Platypus organizes some more panels like this, where some of your ideas could be presented. Okay.
I'm tempted a little bit to just say I'll pass, because I either misread or misunderstood what it was that we were being expected to address in this initial kind of presentation. I did not think of addressing the kind of the prompt, the overall prompt, the framing that Platypus had provided, and instead I concentrated my initial remarks on the kind of the first set of questions that were listed as part of the first topic, and then imagined that we go on to the second, and then the third, and then the fourth. But it's clear that we didn't have a common understanding of what it was we were expected to talk about, and so I'm hesitant to kind of to comment on what the others have said, because my head was in a proverbial different place. And so I think I will pass, okay, and pass it on. Funny use of the word pass, right?
Okay. Well, I too was a little bit mystified by the prompt for the panel, so I just sort of decided to try to talk about everything, so I touched on many of the themes in the prompt, obviously not in great depth. I also tried to concretize what I talked about in terms of current and recent political conjunctures and their significance. And that's where I think I diverge from the other speakers. I certainly do not agree with the first speaker, and I don't think I have any strong disagreements with the other two speakers, but clearly my discussion was in a sort of another frame of reference, which being that in my other persona I teach Hegel and get some very abstract philosophy, it was actually refreshing to talk about some concrete political questions. That's all I have to say for now.
Ross, I wanted to ask you if you might be willing to talk about, or to talk perhaps as a leftist, your experience in ILC as well.
In the ILC? Yeah, so I guess two-pronged approach. First of all, I'd like to respond to just some stuff that Professor Arato Wolfe brings up. I'm curious, perhaps, if he could revisit, his first book, co-authored this on young Lukács, and his interest in sort of revolutionary writings of Lukács after his conversion to Marxism. I'm wondering if I could perhaps ask Professor Arato about the young Arato. What was the interest that he had in the 1970s in Lukács, and why did he feel in the next decade like it was necessary to move in a post-Marxist direction towards an emphasis on civil society, dissociated from the sort of idea of bourgeois society. So it was a sort of civil society in a post-Marxist sense. Civil society, in terms of like what the ILC is trying to do, so the Independent Labor Club ILC, does play an important part, but we aren't so eager to dissociate it from the sort of classical conception of civil society as bourgeois society. We live in bourgeois society since the bourgeois revolution swept the world, and the proletariat necessarily belongs to it. Unfortunately, institutionally, its own organs of self-organization have fallen by the wayside. It's simply viewed as a constituency to be captured by the different bourgeois political parties as voters or as exploitable material. So it does very little of its own organizing in its own name. And that's basically what the Independent Labor Club seeks to do. We conceive of ourselves as a pre-political organization in the sense that we believe that the kinds of programmatic politics, the slogans and whatnot that motivated past political parties, while admirable and understandable in their own time, are not appropriate for the present level of disorganization of the class. What is first required in order for those kinds of programs to become meaningful once again is for us to attain that level of self-organization. And so our main slogans we can basically reduce to a couple of principles. Basically, organizing independently of bourgeois institutions on our own, not endorsing bourgeois political parties, and then internationalism. So we conceive of ourselves as looking to organize the class. And again, these are, we're not been forward a program and whatnot. We're organizing bowling nights. We're organizing talks. We're watching bad movies together. It's the kind of thing that we believe that we look rather to like the late 19th century, early 20th century, where workers' organizations had choruses, they had sports leagues, they had all these different forms of socialization that they could appeal to, that then the various parties of the Second and Third International were then appealing to. And that's what we're looking to rebuild. It's a long shot, but in my view, it's the only shot that we have if humanity is ever going to move on to a higher form of social organization where something like a revolutionary subjectivity is again present. So, yeah, I guess I'll kick it back to Professor Arato.
I would open the Q&A, but I just want to say, John, I thought your speech was great. If you wanted to say a couple of other remarks now from you, what else do you have stuff you have to
On that first topic or on some of the other topics?
Some of the other topics, if there's something.
Well, what do you all think? I mean, is that okay with the rest of you?
Yeah.
All right. So,
Wait. John.
oh, thank you, Ross. I told you I forgot about it. All right. Let me go on then to the second topic. And did everyone see the breakout of the topics? All the people. Okay. So the first question in the second prompt was, how does the left organize discontent within capitalism? And my answer was almost always badly. But I'm not sure, though, that that's how the left should conceptualize this work, or rather how we should conceptualize the left. And I think it might well be better to frame it as, how might a Marxist left contribute to the development of a mass movement adequate, for example, to halting the authoritarian onslaught, to halting the assaults on poor and working class, including immigrant workers, to opposing the prospects of global war. I mean, I could go on with the specifics, but I think that it's, I want to emphasize, I think it is really important at this time, if perhaps at always time, for there to be a Marxist left, and not just for there to be a generic left, no matter how potentially valuable such an organization or a group might be. I think and Ross certainly kind of addressed this, we need to take Marx seriously and use him to understand the kind of our circumstances and what is unfolding still after all these years. So but to turn to the question of discontent, a friend, a comrade, Mike Ryan, who lives in Quebec, or rather in Montreal, wrote a piece on a blog called Three-Way Fight some time ago called The Multiple Factions of Trumpism. And what's important about that is understand your enemy, or to know your enemy is a very, very important thing for a Marxist left to understand. And what Mike argued is that there were, wait a second. Let me move on from that. What Mike argued is whether or not a mass movement arises to resist the Trump administration's authoritarian initiatives is central to how all of this unfolds. I have addressed the form that I think resistance should take. I will limit myself here to reiterating that it is our role in this context to do everything in our power to ensure that the resistance that does arise is unabashedly and resolutely anti-capitalist. And to do so, we need to step outside our comfort zone and engage with the people who are already taken to the streets, many of them for the first time in their lives. And this was written before the events of the last couple of months. I think what he said then was right, it's even more so now. That means a lot more than observing and discussing amongst ourselves. If we are to have any influence, we need to get down in the dirt where it's happening and make our presence felt. The situation that Mike is working in Montreal is somewhat different from what we have here. To do so, though, he returns, we must first and foremost recognize that any perception of the Trump administration as a group of sociopaths behaving irrationally is a non-starter. We need an adequate analysis of the nature of our enemy, including our enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and the existing contradictions between different factions among our opponents and those likely to arise. Now, once again, think about all of the kind of oppositions and contradictions that have emerged within MAGA land in the last perhaps 6 weeks. I don't know exactly when to date it from. It seems potentially very important for us to have understood that and to be able to make some use of it. To address struggles between different factions among our opponents and those likely to arise. To address struggles between and within classes, a solid understanding of the economics at play is essential. Without a clear analysis as the basis for a realistic way forward in our current situation, we risk falling into a panic that will reinforce rather than resist social paralysis. I think that that's well said, and I guess another last comment, and I'll stop, is that the initial prompt made some mention of Trump and Trumpism. I was frankly surprised that it didn't kind of, I'm not arguing that a focus on Trumpism replaces other important matters, okay, but I think it needs to be an integral part of the way we think through the crisis, especially if the crisis includes not only economic, social matters, but also somewhat more narrowly political matters and economic matters, and that we otherwise, I don't know that we're going to have much of a real voice to speak anything in this period. And so I'll stop there. All right? Thank you. I have more stuff written, but I'll wait.
So now we're going to open for Q&A.
Can we hear Arato's response to Ross's question first?
Okay, yeah. Sure. Did you read that, Professor? There was a question. We wanted to hear your response to Ross's question. Or to Ross.
What was the question? Could you repeat it?
Yeah, what was the young Arato's interest in the young Lukács? Can you reconstruct that and your move in a more post-Marxist direction over the course of the next decade in your stress on civil society?
You know, Marx is a great theorist of the 19th century, and certainly, in some sense, Lenin, Trotsky, Lukács, the others are still able to keep this spirit going in their own times. I think that's over. It's over on sociological grounds because the expectation that there would be homogenization of the working class, which would become the immense majority, turned out to be wrong. Secondly, because no one thought of the possibility those days which allowed for the reconstruction of capitalism by new bounds, state interventionist capitalism, which in turn is now cycling between neoliberal neoliberal austerity and interventionism, and that cycle is what we're already in. No one anticipated that possibility of cyclical crisis management in the context of capitalism. So that was the second point. And the third point is that what really no one anticipated, and I think probably even people at this panel have discomfort with it, is that the normative focus for unified action of all kinds has become democracy and democratization. And I think and this is not against Marx's spirit, because he wanted to democratize not just the economic sphere, but also the political democracy. But it is still not what Marxism historically has represented. Now, around the world, if you actually take a look at what is going on, and I think we should be empirical, we will see many movements, many associations, and many forms of mobilization, many contestations, lots of forms of resistance. They'll be different in different countries, but I think their plurality would be true. I cannot really say that this is true for China, but I suspect that the development that is occurring, it will be true in China too. So a plurality of forms of contestation, a plurality of forms of self-organization, a plurality of social ideals will emerge everywhere. And I think that one of the speakers used the phrase, all the movements, or all the initiatives, all the anti-Trump forms of resistance should be understood as anti-capitalist. I sympathize with that personally. That is, for me, that's not a problem. I would like to think of a social organization well beyond capitalism. It is not going to work. It's not going to be the case for all who are in motion to be brought together under the heading of anti-capitalism or socialism or any model of a completely transformed economy that does not continue many aspects, the dynamic aspects of the present. So I would say that the answer to all the questions that this panel has raised is democracy, democracy, democracy. What do we mean by it? What do we mean by it? That's really a question. Because I think a kind of democracy that makes out of industrial workers a subaltern class, a subaltern strata exposed to domination is an incomplete and not very perfect democracy. But I think the concept of democracy can also include the liberation of labor. The concept of democracy surely can include the liberation of women, of genders of various situations, of age groups. I think that it makes sense for us to become part of a projected democratic group. Now, either a political party that represents that. Unfortunately, in the United States, it's very difficult. And I don't say that even the best elements of the Democratic Party represent such a group, although maybe a few on the left of the Democratic Party do represent that view. So I think we need to kind of think about whether even the American system doesn't need to be transformed before such a movement for democracy would be genuinely possible. Okay, that's my 2 cents on all this.
So when I was listening to the responses, I felt like I was seeing 4 different aspects of one image that are fleeting by. And my question is really about the image itself. So let me be more specific. So Professor Arato, you raised the concretization of revolutionary subjectivity, this idea of Lenin's subjective factor, into something like the constitutions in Russia and China. And now you've moved on to this idea of democracy as the adequate form of politics today. John, you talked about this totalizing unit of economic factors, which is producing discontents within capitalism and civil society. Alex, you really took home this question of the necessity of the Revolutionary Party against the betrayals of neo-social democracy and the sectarian rebuttals and critiques of that moment. And then with Ross, I felt almost like we're left with Lukács's formula of 1923 or 1924 in absentia. And one even has a sense of, I don't know, Vienna in the 1920s and coffee houses with workers' choruses being conducted by Anton von Weber. And so my question is, aren't these all, if you will, means to the end, right? We have constitution and democracy. We have economic discontents within our society as they exist. We even have the Revolutionary Party. But what are the ends? Because if the means are being laid out here are rather different, one would hope that these ends that are connected to them are also affected by the different means. Perhaps the question is philosophical. I mean, Alex has taught philosophy. But if so, are we looking at a philosophical principle for all time? How has politics changed the philosophical idea of revolutionary consciousness today?
Could I make a suggestion? I think it might be helpful if 2 or 3 other people add their questions so we have a broader understanding of what people are interested in. I mean, that's
normally we really like asking one question at a time. We always do this in all of our different campus chapters so that the person who asks a question gets their question answered.
Yeah, let's do that.
That's something, because otherwise people will skip some of these questions if they don't like it. And we think the students who ask questions don't want it.
it's your event.
Yeah, let's answer.
This and we want to keep it.
Sure. So in terms of the question of ends, I think the question of ends, I mean, it is Kantian, but it's also brought up by Marx. It's the kingdom of freedom. All of these things are the means to the ends of freedom. So the party, the dictatorship of the proletariat itself, is a free association of producers where the freedom of each is the prerequisite for the freedom of all. So it's the resolution of the problem of individual and collective freedom. And I'd like to, underscore this point, perhaps in contradistinction to Professor Arato, because I think that even democracy should only be conceived of as a means. And Marx and Engels wrote in the manifesto that the task of the proletariat was to win the battle of democracy. It was not the battle for democracy, to democratize society. Rather, he believed that democratic republicanism was already the most adequate form of the state under capitalism and into any foreseeable society until the state itself would disintegrate. Engels, late in life, and this is a point that Lenin raised, quoting Engels in State and Revolution, saw communism as a form of society even beyond democracy itself. Insofar as democracy is the rule of the people, they saw communism as a form of society beyond rule itself, even by a sort of imputed people. So again, a free society of voluntary associations, that's what all this is aiming for. That's what I believe we must, as communists, organize toward through all these different means, party, state, etc.
I don't think we all have the same ends and different means. I think, as far as Professor Arato is concerned, I don't think his ends are at all the same as the ends I believe the other speakers here are talking about, and that is a society of the free association of producers, and that is in the mind of Hegel and Marx the condition of freedom. And that's true democracy. And that kind of democracy does not happen because some political structure has changed. It happens when the very life of society has undergone a fundamental transformation. So there's that. The other thing is, the way I see it, Professor Arato is professing a certain kind of ideology that has a lot in common with the something I mentioned briefly at the beginning of my talk, and that is this notion that we're no longer invested in class society and classes. That was Daniel Bell's idea in the 1950s. That was Francis Fukuyama in more recent times. Post-Marxism is just another echo of that same sentiment. And I think, frankly, it belongs in the Museum of Curious Historical Ideological Antiquities. How could you say that when everything about our society shows a resurgence of working class activity? Now, that activity may not be going in the direction we would like to see, but there is no denying that the working class is active in making its voice heard. our job is to turn that activity, that discontent, in the direction of socialism. And I think that's very doable, but it will take a certain kind of conscious leadership to assist the working class in reaching that conclusion through their own experience. And I want to stress that it has to be done through the working class, doing it through their own experience. You cannot substitute for that. So that's what I have to say. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, give me a crack.
Sure.
So one of the essays that I reread, part of in order to prepare for today, was an essay by, I think, an English guy, Nicholas Stolburn, on this, title which I didn't like, Difference in Marx, and a lot of it is about difference and politics in a minor vein, or some of you probably know this better than I. But the important thing, though, that Stolburn gets to is that the notion of the proletariat is not the kind of the revolutionary class. It's the class that is in the process of becoming, and it's becoming that as part of the unfolding of the capitalist social relations. That, in other words, and Paston, I think, emphasized this as well in one of his essays on Lukács, that kind of that the emergence of an anti-capitalist is not something separate and apart from capital. It is integral to capital. It's where the possibility of its transcendence, its supersession, emerges and must be grasped and then made manifest in some presumably very large mass movements across the globe. And so I want to read just a few sentences from Stolburn and then end with something that he quoted from Marx. While the proletariat is constituted in the complex of capitalist relations, it cannot then be identified with the workers as an autonomous and present identity, for this would be to base politics on an identity formed by and functional to the exploitation of capital. Instead, the proletariat is the class of the overcoming of work and its identities. It is a process which seeks to actualize an absolute movement of becoming within and beyond the social, technical, and natural forces and relations created by capitalist society. At the core of the proletarian mode of composition is the return of a theme of that work was used to criticize the lumpen proletariat. Leave that aside for the moment. That here the critique of work emerges not in an autonomous sphere outside capitalist relations, but in the politics imminent to them, imminent, that is, to the class of workers. In this formulation, as Dove once put it, the proletariat is not the working class, rather the class of the critique of work. And then Marx. It is one of the great, from the, on Friedrich List's book of the National System of Political Economy, that's my kind of bad German translation into English. It is one of the greatest misunderstandings to talk of free human social work, or work without private property. Work is essentially the unfree, inhuman, unsocial activity determined by private property and creating private property. The abolition of private property becomes a reality only when it is understood as the abolition of work. I think that's the end. And I think it's very consistent with Ross's earlier comments.
Andrew.
Andrew, do you want to?
I don't know if you can hear us.
When you play,
There we go.
I think this business is very serious. It's not play.
I think she meant to say reply.
A reply.
Yeah, I mean, but just really wonder if one actually, first of all, identifies sociologically who are going to be the object of the research, who are going to be the proletarians. We're going to find out about what they want. And we will then perhaps have a chance to actually see what the social, political, cultural goals are of the various strata that you would identify as part of this. And my hypothesis would be that we would find a large plurality of those forms of life, cultures, and so on, be any such group as the U.S. working class, if it's even a meaningful concept. Now, of course, this is not completely new for the classics of Marxism, because they proposed a model organization that overcomes all that, that moves from an empirical class consciousness to the genuine, the real class consciousness of participants. I think that historically, some socialist parties and some unions have been successful at doing this. They have been successful at doing this. In the post-Second World War epoch, they're less and less successful, and this is true in part because of 30 glorious years of social democracy, which brought a lot of gains for members of this class, but it is unfortunately also true for this epoch. And I think that the heterogeneity of that type cannot be overcome. The answer of some Marxists is, well, we need a party. Yeah, I think that you've been flying the United States many, many times. And elsewhere, where it has been much more successful than here, those parties become part of the established order and participate in it. That's the history. So the party is over. The party is not going to help. What helps? Well, I think some ideas could help. And I think the idea that we need is one that could appeal to lots of constituencies, lots of groups, lots of associations. And that's why I think democracy is superior to socialism. Who believes really out there in socialism? What's the constituency for socialism out there? If you really study, even in a country where welfare states are somewhat more intact than here, even in Sweden or Finland, that would be an interesting question. Try it out in China, who believes in socialism in China, and see how far you're going to get. So I think, I think as Marx for his own time, and as Lenin, Lukács, and the others for a later epoch, we should not tell reality that it should kneel down in front of our great ideas and our great traditions and our great dogmas, because they're dogmas, I think, this dogmatism that I hear on this panel. What we have to actually try to find out is what it is they want. Where is it that they want to go? And if we find heterogeneity there, the next question is, how could that be brought together? How could these things be go together? It's been possible for people out there, and not Marxists at all, to bring together race and gender and region and age in fairly successful ways. For example, that was the new left in the United States. It happens in lots of places that these things are brought together on the basis of, what was the new left idea? Participatory democracy. That was the one original idea of the new left. And it worked a lot better than socialism. I'm not against socialism. We need any kind of new movement or new set of initiatives. I would be happy to be part of the socialist group or branch within that to explain that the tension between capitalism and democracy cannot be abolished except for fairly radical means. So I have nothing against that myself. I just think you can't go out there in the world and mobilize on that basis.
Hello. I want to bring it back to Marx. For Marx, I think the question of political subject and political object are very important, because it's also a question of who is going to do the revolution, how's the revolution going to come about, who's going to do the politics of the revolution. I wanted to ask, maybe Ross will help me out with this. Why did Marx insist on his delegation of the proletariat as the subject of history, or the object of history, as the class that would make the revolution? What was the core of his reason? Was he merely being empirical and looking at the antagonisms of his time and seeing the relationship of proletariat to the bourgeoisie? Was he taking that as an apparatus and merely using it? Or was there another reason for his choice? This is to the panel. So.
You know, I can't resist an answer to this, so very quickly, just a few words. Marx learned revolution from the 18th century. And revolution from what was later the rising called bourgeois revolutions, but I think in many respects they were democratic revolutions already. That's where he learned revolution. And in the 19th century, in lots of settings, this is an idea that really did move a lot of people. In the 20th century, the history of revolutions is such that to attract people to a revolutionary ideology would be extremely difficult, and rightly so. Dictatorship of proletariat. Who wants another version of dictatorship? Who wants a revolutionary dictatorship? A revolutionary rupture, and then who covers the revolutionary rupture? The revolution is not dead, because there will be revolutions all the time, but for us, revolution should not be a slogan at all. And those who are attracted by the idea of being revolutionary are deluding themselves.
Okay. Well, just a brief answer to that question. The working class is the inheritor of all the products of what Hegel called the work of the spirit. So all that passed through from the French Revolution up to the middle of the 19th century, when you had the rise of the bourgeoisie, at a certain moment in history, the bourgeoisie was no longer capable of being the handmaiden of that legacy. And the working class inherits that. That was Marx's idea. And Engels says that explicitly in his writing on the Ludwig Feuerbach in the end of German classical philosophy. So that's the point Marx was making. And I mean, to get behind that, then you have to see that the working class is the only class that has no stake in the status quo, objectively. It may think it does, of course, whereas the other classes in society do. Therefore, that in some way clouds their judgment and clouds their ability to stand for what would be the liberation of humanity. So that's where that comes from. That's my quick answer.
So as to the question of why the proletariat for Marx, so Alex already pointed out that, yes, for Marx, and again, this is sort of a reply to Arato too, yes, I would agree that Marx learned revolution from the 18th century. That's what haunted all the revolutionaries of 1848, including Marx, who was a critic of the various strains of socialism of his time. So Marx viewed the proletariat as inheritors of the mantle of the Third Estate. The Third Estate, of course, under the Ancien regime, appeared as a sort of undifferentiated mass. There were peasants, there were merchants, artisans, and so on. It was only after the ascendance of bourgeois society that fissures began to emerge within it. So the proletarianized working class, which sort of emerged as the result of a crisis within bourgeois society, the crisis of industrialization, the new industrial forces of production, was identified as the universal class for Marx because it was what necessarily mediated the process of production for all of society. So the animating principle of capitalist society is, as the name suggests, capital itself. What is capital? Capital is the alienated subjectivity of the working class itself. It's the product of the working class's own making. So it's only, but of course, in terms of its experience of the society that it itself generates, it views it as this sort of just objective life world, this just the way things are. And that, of course, is what Marx referred to as the fetishism of commodities, and what Lukács then sought to thematize more explicitly as reification. And it's only by reclaiming sort of its own unconscious subjectivity, by awakening to consciousness the commodity form itself, because for Lukács, the proletariat was the self-consciousness of the commodity itself, that the proletariat could then take the reins of society, take command of the process that it itself was generating already unconsciously, and move it in a direction deliberately. So that's why. It's because it is the necessary mediator of the total process of production, the totality of the world of things that is based on its own productive activity. That's why for Marx, it has to be the proletariat. And whatever happens in terms of like the mutations of capitalism, the increasing superfluity of labor, the fact that increasing portions of the world's population are surplus labor that can't find work. Nevertheless, like the principle of society is still measured on necessary labor time and the fact that people are forced to work for a living in order to be considered valuable to the system itself.
Okay. I just wanted to add that I think Marx learned about revolutions from some of the events of the 19th century as well, and that one of them was the 1848 revolutions across the European continent, but perhaps most importantly was the Commune. That was the decisive manifestation, crystallization of the possibility of a post-capitalist world. And as you know, kind of the role of the First International's chapters inside Paris were absolutely essential to the emergence of the Commune and to its kind of its far-reaching social transformational project. And that's why I think that even though the critique of the Gotha program, written I believe in 1885, was a very short pamphlet, it was not an extended work, actually has contained within it some of the most remarkable passages of Marx trying to imagine what a post-capitalist society might look like. And I would urge people to read, if you haven't already, the book by Peter Udis called The Alternative to Capitalism. Peter is a member of the International Marxist Humanist Organization. And the book by Paresh Chattopadhyay about, I forget now the title, I'm sorry, an Indian Marxist.
The Associated Mode of Production.
The Associated Mode of Production. Thanks, Ross. For kind of some, kind of re-looking at
the somewhat... Kunal?
Excuse me?
You're talking about Kunal Chattopadhyay?
Paresh.
Oh, I don't know.
Right. It's really, I think, important that so much of what has been taken for granted as part of the Marxist corpus, the Marxist legacy, is almost certainly just wrong. And that, for example, Peter, in that book that I talked about, talks about what Marx meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it's not what most of us learned growing up, okay? It is a very different, specific historical moment. It is the rule of the immense majority of the people during the revolutionary transition from out of capitalism, okay? It's not an enduring, permanent feature of some yet-to-be-desired society after capitalism. And dictatorship never had the meaning that it's come to acquire, in the 20th century, and Marx could not have imagined it, something like that. It just simply meant the rule of the majority, the overwhelming majority of the population would rule in its own interest, and in fact, matter of fact, in the interest of all. So I kind of suggest that we certainly need to, be Marxist, but we need to actually also relearn our Marx more perhaps than we learn to memorize it. You already did. Yeah.
I was going to say I'd like to take moderator's privilege to ask a question to panelists.
Sure.
I want to kind of rephrase, I guess, the title of the panel, but I would ask,
Now you tell us.
I want to ask, what is the possibility for revolutionary politics today? And is that what we're aiming for? And if so, how does this task the left? And also, if so, then how is that task bound up with Marxism?
Well, I mean, it's certainly the politics that I'm interested in. Yes, I mean, to the extent is it possible, that's to be determined by what, to some extent, by what we do. It's not going to, revolutionary politics is not going to emerge out of nothing. It's not going to emerge from nowhere. And I would, urge people in that regard to kind of reread C.L.R. James about, kind of, especially in the book that was edited of his writings from the late, mostly from the early 1960s, titled Marxism for Our Times, which includes a kind of a retrospective look at the kind of the great value that was contributed by the Johnson Forest tendency, but also the terrible shortcomings of that tendency as well, for some new appreciation of Marxism and revolutionary politics. I won't go into it now.
I mean, this is a topic I touched upon in my talk, and I think the possibilities of what you're calling revolutionary politics are certainly there. And I will say this about this whole discussion about the subject and object of history gets a little bit abstract, because what determines the revolutionary potential of the working class, the subject of history, is very much the kind of leadership it has. And I will say that without any apology. Certain moments in history can prove decisive depending on what kind of leadership is present at that moment. And we have passed through certain moments like that. I think the events in Greece in 2015 were an example of that. Had Syriza been a different kind of political animal, the fate of the Greek working class would have been very different. I think I was there, I interviewed people. They were prepared to fight all the way. Their leadership let them down. And had that moment been wrestled with, it could have changed a lot of other things politically, internationally. So yes, leadership makes a very big difference. Not always, not at every moment, but every once in a while there are these crucial moments that happen. And you have to prepare for them. And that's what revolutionary politics is all about.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I feel like the possibility of revolutionary politics today feels very distant, very remote. I think that's part of what motivates the Independent Labor Club to do what it does in its own self-conception as a pre-political organization. We believe that for revolutionary politics to again become possible, and that is, to be quite clear, what we're all interested in. The groundwork first has to be laid in terms of creating the kinds of institutions, the kinds of independent organizations on which something like a revolutionary leadership, something like a party, could even then emerge. I believe that even like the great debates of the past between anarchism and Marxism, Marx and Bakunin in the First International, between Bolshevism and social democracy, between communism and social democracy in these Second and Third Internationals, reformism and revolution, those debates, we're not even at the stage where we're able to have those debates meaningfully once again. Of course, once we attain to a certain level of subjectivity, once we have solidified organs of our own political consciousness and independence such that we can constitute ourselves independently from the different bourgeois political organizations, the NGOs, the Democrats, the Republicans, etc., then we can have those debates again. And I think, of course, we should be cognizant of the entire revolutionary history that precedes us. But I don't think we're even at that point yet. The difference today that we face as opposed to, say, socialists on the continent and in America and around the capitalist world in the 1870s is that whereas they had to contend with the memory of the French Revolution that came before them, the names of Robespierre and Danton that haunted them, that weighed like a nightmare on their consciousness. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, all these different names, right? I could name more. They themselves, in a way that they could not have anticipated, now weigh on us in a similar way. What we have to contend with as revolutionaries who are interested in, again, taking up the mantle of Marxism in a meaningful way, is with the ruins of Marxism itself. That's something that didn't exist. So like the failure of actually existing socialism. And that is a novel situation. The other thing too, I do think that changes in the organization of production are important. I think that workers organize themselves on an independent basis in a more organic and unconscious fashion in the past, just because industrial production assembled them into these vast factories, onto shop floors, in the thousands, where they could then just sort of spontaneously form these kinds of workers' associations, these clubs and whatnot, choruses, etc. I feel that the current way that industrial production is organized is more dispersed, atomized, and so that any form of self-organization that then takes place that could then build a revolutionary politics on the back of that has to be more deliberate, more conscious. And that's, again, another part of the theory that informs our activity.
It's a one word for me. I would say, speaking as an American, and not an Hungarian or any other political community, that I think in the United States the chances of a revolution in the sense that we use the term are zero. Most chances are zero, and it's a waste of time to become a sect which is dedicated to talking about that. I think I can't call us a church because we're too small, so a sect is the only relevant. Do not become a sect. That's number one. Number two, we had this opportunity in New York City. I think it's kind of remarkable that a person born in Uganda of Indian heritage, Muslim by religion, can be elected the mayor of this city, which is, I hate to tell you, it's bigger than many countries. And New York City is larger and it has more voters than many countries. So I would say that if you are experimenting about it and you want to think about what of socialism could realize soon, then I think to mobilize here in New York on behalf of this mayoralty would be important. And it's not even a riskless proposition because in spite of their meeting at the White House, it is going to become enemy number one of Trump and the Trump government as soon as he does anything. And so I think that's one thing that people who do not want to become a sect and want to be involved in politics would be focused on politics in the small area, which actually 8 million people or so. And I would say that's, to say that he doesn't qualify by some standards of some socialist dogma is ridiculous. I think we have to do what is possible, and it's admirable that in New York City this could already happen.
Natalie, can I add one thing to what Ross said? I have a great deal of sympathy for what the ILC is trying to do. I do think, though, that Ross, there's some, perhaps there are some jump starts available to us. I'm thinking, for example, of the emergence of the incredible grassroots networks of opposition to the ICE assaults that happened in Los Angeles, perhaps most notably in Chicago, over the course of the last 4 or 5 months, all right? That the level of sophistication of people acting politically, not going to a demonstration, they may do some of that as well, but engaged in a whole variety of forms of self-organization and mutual aid is really quite extraordinary. And that we need to appreciate it, we need to understand it, and we need to imagine ways in which it might be sustained over time. And I think that the contribution of the ILC kind of approach is perhaps especially valuable at that moment or that juxtaposition. So, thanks.
Thank you. I guess I have two questions, one for Professor Arato directly and one for the panel as a whole. Firstly, for the panelists, what is the relationship between the working class and the political party of the working class? That is to say, can one kind of just pick out, you know, from like the population statistics, you know, who is a worker and define it that way and say, okay, we need to organize them. And that's how we, you know, create like revolutionary subjectivity, so to speak? Or is it something else? Does the working class actually require a political party to cohere as such? Why did someone like Lenin or Trotsky think that a split in the party was the condition for a revolution? That is to say that revolutionary subjectivity had required this kind of moment of contradiction, to be kind of, I guess, cliche. And additionally, for Professor Arato, what is the influence of Postone on your thought at the moment, or in the past specifically? What relevance does Postone's kind of critique, I think, at the moment of the New Left, what did it have for you? Does it still have a kind of importance for your thought today? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that last one right away because Moïse Postone was a very close friend of mine for a very long time. And we spent a lot of time together. And we were reading Marx together too, in Marx groups. And then he went his own way, which is, of course, intellectually brilliant. But, you know, the problem that I already saw with Lukács is that at the last moment, the gulf between abstract theorizing and the Leninist question, what to do, could not be bridged. And Morsch never bridged that. And on some level, I think it was a function of what he chose to do, because he tried to derive from Uncle Charlie, as I call him, from Marx himself, a method for producing revolutionary contestation, revolutionary consciousness, revolutionary practice. And you can't, you know, you can't get from Marx any more than from Hegel or from Condorcet or from Kant. And I would say even Hermann Marcuse, if you're reading him now, and some of you probably still know who he is, there's nothing in Marcuse which will help directly. So unfortunately, we must invent the answers ourselves. But you can only invent answers if you surrender the status of a sect that repeats dogma after dogma after dogma. In other words, stop doing what you already are doing, some of you, and what some of the panelists were doing. Namely, repeat things that you have believed for 50 years or more, and think that somehow this time they will work. And they won't. And they didn't work then, and they're going to work even less now.
So I'm not a fan of building a party in any case. I think that the two dominant models of parties that we're familiar with are the vanguard parties, which I think were dreadful and continue to be dreadful to the extent that they're still living on life support, and the social democratic mass parties, such as they are. I think neither one of us serves us very well. Having said that, I think that the class certainly could benefit from forms of revolutionary organization. I don't think it has to be one. I think it can be a multiplicity of forms that reflect different circumstances and kind of concerns and possibilities. Having said that, Also, I think that, oddly enough, there is one thing that I agree with Professor Arato, in spite of probably all the other stuff that I don't agree with him on, and that is that sectarianism was a dreadful kind of development in the history of the left. And it goes back, Marx was, kind of aware of and kind of had nothing but scorn for the sectarians of his day. And in that regard, I guess I would point out is that one very helpful model to think about for organization is the First International across the globe and here even in the United States. So, enough.
Yeah, a lot of the discussion about subjectivity gets very abstract here. Lenin had a few things to say about that. He said it was very important to pay attention to the consciousness of the masses in order to know what to do next. For instance, after certain events, I forget, 1907 or something, he was trying to figure out, are we in a period of a revival of the class struggle, or are we in a period of retreat and defensive actions? It's important to understand things like that. That's where subjectivity becomes concretized in the form of a political perspective and political programs. And although there seems to be a lack of enthusiasm in this panel for political parties, I think there is no substitute for a political party. That's how class interests are expressed through parties. Now, whether you call that party a vanguard party or a mass party or whatever, you have to first of all have a political party, and that political party must be an independent political party that expresses the interests of your class. So the contrary position really has nothing to back it in terms of any kind of successes that they can point to in the last 100 years. Where have you seen successful revolutions where there has been no political party? I don't know of any.
Could you tell us what ones are the successful socialist revolutions?
Well, there was something called October. That was a successful revolution.
How long?
It was a failed world revolution.
I'm sorry for interrupting.
How long? Okay. Yes, it ultimately died. That's true. Does that mean that no revolution is ever going to be successful? Well, if that's what you believe, then no amount of reorganizing or reconfiguring or anything else is going to lead to a successful revolution. So, the logic here escapes me, frankly. Give me an example of a successful revolution that was not based on a political party.
The most successful revolution that I know was the era of Black Reconstruction in the post-Civil War South. Okay, that was defeated not by the internal betrayal of its goals and principles by its leaders. It was betrayed by the political coup executed by the Democratic Party in the election of 1876, where Reconstruction was destroyed. All right, that's if you want an example of a successful revolution, that's it. And then I would also mention the Commune as well. Maybe success is kind of to avoid killing it yourself is to have it be killed by someone else.
Well, I'm not convinced. What can I say?
Well, I mean, I personally am quite sympathetic to the idea. I believe that a party, inevitably, once the mass movement attains a kind of critical mass, something like a party, something akin to a party, becomes appropriate. The problem, I think, is that we're not even at the point where we can pose these questions meaningfully. Again,
That's right.
I believe, and I'm quite sympathetic to the idea of a party in the sense that Lenin and his co-thinkers, articulated it as sort of on the front lines. That's what the vanguard meant to someone like Lenin. As to the composition of the party itself, it could be composed of intellectuals from various class strata Workers themselves, of course, could serve in the capacity as intellectuals. Again, I don't view this primarily as a sociological question. The relationship of the party to the class, once that becomes historically appropriate, I think has to be dialectical. And sometimes it does necessitate something like a split when there are antagonistic interests that are present within the class itself and within the historical moment. But to reply perhaps to something that Professor Arato said in the previous round of questions, like with his relative enthusiasm for the candidacy for the the mayorship of Zoran Mamdani, I believe that running candidates, self-proclaimed socialist candidates, and perhaps he is a socialist of a certain kind, perhaps he's a bourgeois socialist, as would have been described in the manifesto. I think that to run socialist candidates on the ticket of a bourgeois party does not represent politics, or not the kind of politics that I'm interested in. It's rather the liquidation of politics, the liquidation of actually proletarian politics. So we'll see what happens with him. We already had a DSA-branded Democrat in the mayor's office of New York before, David Dinkins. What did that give us? It gave us Giuliani. So let's see where it goes from here, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to go back a bit, and I want to be a bit sympathetic to Professor Arato. Not because I necessarily agree with everything that he said, but I feel like he is representing in a way a very widespread notion on the left that a lot of people hold, whether consciously or unconsciously, that it is a certain position of, okay, the working class is the revolutionary subject, that's over. We don't have that anymore today. And there is a moment of truth to that. And I think that is sort of what has also been expressed in conversation around the last 5 to 10 minutes, is that we're all sort of looking for answers on what to do. And I think a big problem is, of course, that there is a moment of truth to the working class and the revolutionary subject not existing anymore today. And so the immediate sort of instinct is, of course, to ask, okay, well, what can we do to make that happen again? And you sort of said we may not even be in a position where we can meaningfully ask that sort of question. And so what I think may be helpful is to look into the past and sort of ask, okay, what has happened in the last decades for us to be in this position today, where there are large portions on the left which consciously or unconsciously don't believe in working class as the revolutionary subject anymore. And I sort of want to encourage to think about what has happened specifically on the left since after World War II. I'm just making that emphasis because the obvious answer is sort of, okay, that the failure of international socialist revolution has happened. But I sort of want to encourage to maybe think about specifically what has happened on the left since after World War II for us to be in this position today.
Very simply, I think when you speak about the left, that's a very broad category. There are those of us on the left who have not been carried away by the wave of pessimism and that seems to infect large numbers of groups that call themselves part of the left or part of the socialist movement or something. Yes, I mean, we have been in a period where the working class has been defeated far more than it's achieved any victories. That's true. And we've also been in a period where, for a very long period, there was, you might say, a certain accommodation that capitalism made that allowed the working class to have a more or less comfortable life, but that period is over. It's been over for a while. And it's not accidental that the whole project of neoliberalism is now over as well. And with it, the remnants of bourgeois democracy. These have revolutionary implications, and we're seeing some of those revolutionary implications. Although again, they're not in the form we would like to see them. So far, they mostly manifest themselves in the rise of the extreme right. But we also see such events as the mass movement in support of Mamdani. And yes, whatever else Mamdani stands for, you cannot ignore this wave of enthusiasm that captured hundreds of thousands, not millions of New Yorkers. So that tells you something, that there is some potential here for building a socialist movement. If you don't see that, then I don't know where you live.
I would say, though, that, I mean, there was enthusiasm around Obama, too. I'm not trying to say that they're exactly the same, though I do feel like they are garnering a similar kind of interest in terms of Democratic Party operatives, like seeing Mamdani as kind of the future mold in which, the next round of, whether it's AOC or whoever it happens to be, the party will move itself. And certainly the DSA wants to move in that direction. To answer the question, Marx's identification of the proletariat as the universal class was not necessarily based on an empirical proposition. Of course, there was an independent workers' movement that existed in England at the time, Chartism, after the failure of the 1832 Reform Bill. But even that was beginning to fall apart by the time that Engels and Marx were, really coming into their own as theorists. Rather, it was a logical proposition based on the position of the proletarian as working class within society, such that the wealth of society, organized according to the principle of capital accumulation, required mediation through this class, through its labor. I think that there's a similar, one can even look back to Lukács. There's a difference between the empirical consciousness of the working class at any given moment and the imputed class consciousness of the proletariat as the revolutionary subject of history. The difficulty is to bring those two things into alignment. We're at quite a far remove, I believe, just realistically speaking, from having those two things be one and the same. Nevertheless, I view that as the only possibility to overcome the present configuration of society. And that's why, distant though the possibility may be, I'm interested in organizing in the Independent Labor Club towards rebuilding something like a revolutionary subjectivity. Because at present, the only real subject moving society, determining its historical trajectory, is capital. We have to reclaim that because that itself is the product of our own making.
Well, let me address what is at stake here. About us, you're asking Lenin's question, что делать? What is to be done? And I think that's always a good question. Whatever else you think about Lenin, laughing at Paul Lukács has translated the Russian into что делать into something weird. But anyway, that's something that indicates that he really cared about politics, and probably that so much of Marxism has not inherited the attitude of even Marxists who really did care about organization, about politics, and even about elections, where the stakes were not electing a candidate that he so much liked. So I think that what we have to face with this Mamdani question is this question of что делать. In other words, we can denounce him and say that he is not a Marxist at all, or he's not the right kind of socialist. But the fact is that given the American political system as now, there is very, very few people have gotten into the position for representing even what he represents. And I think that this question will be even with us in about 2.5 years from now when the presidential election comes. I mean, let's assume that the Democratic candidate is Gavin Newsom running against J.D. Vance, let's say, as a is that irrelevant to us, how that turns out? Do we care about the results of such things? Of course, it depends on Newsom, what he will represent at that particular time. But I think this is where politics is. And I think that I don't mind abstract theory. I think even dogmas historically have played an important role in clarifying people's minds. But there are things to do out there in our situation. And waiting for a revolution in the United States carried out by the remnant of the traditional working class is zero. It's a pie in the sky. It means nothing. The only thing that matters is the existing political process, where all you get is Mamdani's and Newsom's at its best. Or secondly, how these people can be influenced if they are actually in power. So in New York City, which is relatively small scale, what I think would be important is forms of self-organization to emerge to put the city government under some kind of pressure on lots of issues. I think that would be an extremely useful and important thing to do for even academics and even young people. In other words, to try to organize, as Vladimir Ilyich said, do, but do something with your organization and it put people under pressure who are pressurable. And I think to say that's a waste of time because they're not the right kind of leftists, or that they're not Marxists, or, I mean, well, that is to surrender politics Ooh, by the way, just one more thing. We are in the midst of no longer the classical neoliberal era. We're in the midst of a right-wing populist era. And we should realize that the fight against right-wing populists can be much more difficult than the fight against neoliberal austerity. And yet that's what we are going to face now. In other words, you talk about working class. Whom do actual workers in the United States vote for? What is Trump's vote in the last presidential election from working class constituencies, working class regions, and so on? Did he defeat Harris in the last election with respect to the working class vote? I would suspect yes. But actual workers are going in the direction of right-wing populism. That's a real challenge to us, not how to make a revolution in the United States.
I kind of wanted to make a case question, which is that it felt like the thrust of it was really, what has the left gone through in the last 25 years, the last 50 years? But really, what has the left gone through in its recent history that has caused us to be at this point today?
I was hesitant to talk because I felt we've talked too much already. But I think that you're absolutely right. But I think that it's a question of history to some extent. It's not just to pronounce that, one or two sentence verdicts, okay, but what was in fact the kind of, what happened in the immediate, actually what happened, I think you would probably benefit from going back to the 1930s. And the kind of the eventual emergence of the Popular Front as a dominant political current, and that endured well into the post-war era, and then, in an odd way, reemerged at the moment of the Vietnam War. I have a funny family story to tell that amongst my political friends when I was in college, or immediately after I graduated in 1969. There was a great deal of sympathy for the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was supporting Vietnam in the war against the U.S. monster, okay, and that was certainly true, except that it spilled over into a much more broad acceptance of, a justification of virtually every, crazy thing that Stalin had done. And I apparently was infected by that sentiment, okay, and at one point I was home in Brooklyn with my father, and I must have said something that he read as being pro-Russian, pro-Soviet, and he said to me, okay, my dad was not politically active or sophisticated is always say, well, Johnny, tell me, if things are so good there and so bad here, how come everyone there wants to come here and no one here wants to go there? Now, it was very wise, okay? And I think that the kind of one other thing that Platypus did for me as a nice favor is they invited me to write a review of Adolph Reed's The Book on the South, I guess 2 years ago, 3, I forget, okay? And I actually tried to grapple with, what exactly is Adolph Reed's politics? And I concluded at the end that he was an embodiment of a certain kind of continuing popular frontism. And I think that that's part of the story. Now, there were lots of other stories. The emergence of, and I agree with Professor Arato that the emergence of the New Left was a remarkable moment, although I think it needs to be situated in the context of the already existing civil rights movement, okay, and specifically Mississippi Freedom Summer and its influence on the emergence of the free speech movement at Berkeley. That those are parts of the history as well. And then eventually the self-implosion of SDS, okay, around some crazy politics that were emerging from within it, okay, has a part of the story. So it's a story that's complicated, but it's certainly a story worth studying and understanding. And I don't know that I certainly am not ready to pronounce, okay? After years of study, I can tell you that. I don't think it's that. But I think we should take very seriously the question that you pose and the challenge that you pose. And there's probably a lot of resources that we could use to do so.
Yeah, I've spoken about this already a bit. I'll just say that speaking of the left in general is too abstract. You have to break up its components. There is that left that I would say are the inheritors of the Marxist tradition or the Trotskyist tradition. There is that left that rejects all those traditions. There is that left that's part of the Stalinist tradition, if you can call that a tradition. In my mind, the new left was basically a reaction against the Stalinist tradition, which went to certain extremes where the very notion of the revolutionary potential of the working class was just dropped for whatever, for various reasons that we don't have to go into here. So if you're going to talk about the left, let's talk about it in terms of what it actually consisted of. Who was the left? What groups were the left? What were their theories? What did they actually do? I really don't want to continue going on discussing the left in some general sense that doesn't really make too much sense.
So the left in my lifetime, for the last 30 years or so at least.
You're only 30 years old?
No. Well, I mean, since I wasn't going to be part of the left when I was like 2, 3 years old. No, I'm not 30 years old. But regardless, like as far as I can remember back, it's like summit hopping. It's the anti-globalization movement that gave way to the anti-war movement. There was new SDS. There was the Answer Coalition, Stop the War in Britain. There was the Occupy movement, and then there was the rise of democratic socialism, Bernie, AOC, now Mamdani. Whatever differences, the different flavors of the left, I think that its concrete role in organizing discontents, and perhaps this is getting at the one question that I didn't really choose to focus on in my remarks, has been to basically redirect the discontents expressed by different portions of the population, different parts of the class, back into safe channels, back into the Democratic Party in the U.S., into labor, even when they formed into left populist parties in, say, Europe, into Syriza, into Podemos. They essentially bowed down before the European Bank. These are all, again, none of them really tried to organize themselves on an independent basis. And even while I can take heart in the fact that there is a kind of organic resistance to the ICE raids and whatnot, and obviously I'm very sympathetic to those, to the, people organizing to prevent masked thugs from abducting people. these forms of organization usually prove to be very ephemeral. They disappear after the threat is gone, as soon as a Democratic president is elected. What happened to the protests against ICE when Biden was in office? They basically went away. You still heard grumblings here and there, but they really only reemerged when Trump was reelected, and I find that profoundly disheartening. And that's why I'm interested in, again, constituting something separate, something independent from bourgeois politics as presently constituted, so that the kind of politics that I'm actually interested in, revolutionary politics, the question of the party, can again be put on the table in a way that actually means something.
Aaron?
Thank you, everybody. I'd like to ask a question about another concept we get from Lukács, which is reification. Earlier on in the panel, I seem to recall Andrew saying, on the one hand, Lenin put the question of subjectivity on the table, right? He raised the subjective question. But then on the other hand, Andrew, I think you said something along the lines of the new economic policy, like Deng Xiaoping, recognized that you can't skip objective development of capitalism via consciousness. And I feel like this idea of needing to follow from the objective development of capitalism has actually kind of dogged the entire discussion, right? Whether we're talking about whether or not there still exists a proletariat, whether or not neoliberal capitalism and its demise is putting the question of class back on the table. And even, Ross, the idea of capital being the subject, right? Because of course for Marx there was a dialectical relationship between labor and capital, and the constitution of the proletariat was a part of the constitution of capital and vice versa. And so it almost doesn't make a lot of sense to say, well, there's no proletariat, but there's capital, which is subject. And that kind of leads you back in a funny way, right, to the overdetermination of power, right? Because then capital is this heteronymous oppressive force, right? It's the subject and we're not, and that's the problem. So I wanted to ask, what is the subjective factor in history that Lenin was trying to raise? And is it different from what I feel like we're participating in on this panel, which is sort of looking at how capitalism changes around us as an objective transformation that we kind of observe, and making maybe pronouncements or judgments about what needs to be done in response to that? Thanks.
Well, first of all, I don't think you can just sort of divide up the world into the subjective over here and the objective over there. The subjective contains the objective contains the subjective, in different ways and different forms. And those are always evolving, they're dynamic. And the role of a conscious leadership in a political party is part of that whole dynamic. Now, as far as Lenin goes, Lenin understood that, but he more or less understood that instinctively. I wouldn't say he was a major theorist on the issue. He was not, but he did understand that. He understood that you had to pay attention to where the masses were at. In later years, we had a better understanding of that, particularly with the rise of what are called the Freudo-Marxists, who began to pay attention to the question of mass psychology, the psychology of the masses. Any political movement that ignores the psychology of the masses is doomed to failure. And how you understand the psychology of the masses and how you can therefore interact with the masses is a key question today. And that's one that's I think has been largely neglected by many on the left, including many self-professed Marxists. And that's something that needs more attention today.
So perhaps I wasn't clear in my remarks, but capital as the subject of society, it appears that way, and perhaps it is in a sense, insofar as the proletariat lacks self-conscious subjectivity. But capital itself is just the alienated subjectivity of the working class. The task, I think, of revolutionaries, once institutions of the working class have been constituted on an independent basis, is to awaken proletarian class consciousness to its own interests, such that it can become so that it can reclaim the subjectivity that has been cast over against itself as capital, and direct society and social production itself towards its own ends, towards the interests of all, to the provision of the needs of society as a whole. That's why I believe that perhaps it makes sense that Pistone postulated capital as the subject of history after the definitive failure of the Russian Revolution in 1991, when his book was published just a couple of years later. Lukács, by contrast, is writing at the very beginning of that process, and wrote that essay in 1921, so just a few years into that world revolutionary sequence. I believe I'm more on the side of Lukács there, even if it makes sense that at the time when Pistone was writing, it appeared like capital was just this unchallenged power, and that class really would not play the kind of role that classical Marxists had believed it would. I very much am on the side of Lukács in all of this.
Okay.
President, would you like to respond?
Don't think he hears you.
Dr. Arato, would you like to respond? Different question?
I don't know. Okay.
Allison?
This is just a very simple, straightforward question, I think, but I hope will open something up. For Mr. Steinberg, you mentioned in Occupy, you noticed that a lot of the people there were working class youth.
Yeah.
How did you identify them as working class youth?
I spoke to them.
What is the working class that you experienced there? Were you calling them working class kind of against the notion of Occupy as like the downwardly mobile children of bourgeoisie?
Well, that was more my experience.
I know. There were young people there from places like Western Pennsylvania. There was someone I met there who he actually was not so young. He was a worker in the construction industry who was sort of, I guess, what we would call a precariat type worker who sort of traveled around the country finding work wherever he could, and he made a deliberate trip to New York to take part in the Occupy thing. There were some young women I spoke to from, I think they were from Bethlehem, if I recall, and they were clearly working class. Their family were, they were all workers in factories in that area and so on. They were inspired by Occupy, and they came down to take part. I'm not saying everybody there, there were certainly what you'd call the downwardly mobile sons and daughters of the bourgeoisie. There was some of that, yeah. But the people I mostly spoke to were pretty much working class people. You want to say something?
Are you making a sociological distinction on working class there?
What do you mean? Did I take a survey or something? No, I'm not a sociologist, and I don't really think that kind of method leads you very far anyway.
I mean, I don't have an answer to that question, but
Why it matter that Occupy, let's say, of 300 people that you have seen participating, a certain percentage is working class by some sociological definition. No, what really matters is that they are there and they are doing what they're doing irrespective of their past background. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's just something that a heritage of a certain kind of Marxism that you think, in order to legitimate protest or resistance, you need to find working class credentials. Why? I think the more important thing is precisely that they are organized. It's important to figure out what they're asking and how what they're asking could be satisfied. Are they putting somebody under pressure or not? Do they represent any kind of power? Do they have support in the rest of society would be important too. But the one thing that doesn't matter is whether the percentage of workers among them is 20% or 25% or 30%. It just doesn't matter.
I agree with Professor Arato on that matter.
I think what Professor Arato said is completely irrelevant, frankly.
Well, there you have it.
Had nothing to do with
who's
anything
the lucky
I said.
winner? How about that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Somebody back there.
I think Dan has had his hand up for a long time.
Yeah.
And he's been very patient.
This is for Professor Arato, primarily. You accuse Marxists of being out of date, and that's not the first time I've heard that. But when I hear you going on about civil society, or local action, or modest local efforts, that is amazingly out of date. I mean, that was prevalent in the 80s and 90s. So you are essentially voicing an antique dogma. And since then, what have we seen? We've seen the amazing polarization of global capitalism. We've seen the tripling of the global proletariat, now that China is part of global production. We have seen the fracturing of the US constitutional structure. We have seen dramatic steps towards an authoritarian global political structure. So everything has changed, and yet you are somehow still touting these ancient dogmas about civil society. So it seems to me that the person who is really behind the times is you, not us.
Yeah, I'll just say that it is often the case that those who accuse others of being dogmatists are themselves the worst dogmatists.
I largely agree with the comments that were just made, but I would say that there is a place for civil social organizing, but precisely insofar as it's important to rebuild, because the proletariat itself is part of bourgeois society. I think, though, unlike Professor Arato, I'm not afraid of the association of civil society with bourgeois society, as Hegel, Marx, etc. Saw them as largely synonymous. I agree with the person who just asked the question that the framework of civil society that Dr. Arato put forward in the 80s with Gene Cohen was largely a response to the sort of state socialist regimes and trying to forge new democratic politics that I think itself has been definitively thrown into crisis in the last 30 years. I mean, whatever the left's response is inadequate, though they have been.
Okay. Just one thing, I think what Dan mentioned about the international context that we need to keep in mind is especially important, and it's the first time that's been articulated here this afternoon, and it really needs to always be kept in mind. We're too quick to ignore it, and we need to learn more and appreciate more. Thanks, Dan. Silence.
You refer to our book from the early 90s, and I'm certainly willing to think that a lot of it is now obsolete, or at least it has been badly challenged by time. And what is remarkable to me is that, in a way, it was the right that picked up this civil society orientation. And yes, I already said that workers vote for Trump, so the working class orientation is no immunity from being utilized by the other side. I think that this was true in the rise of fascism too, during the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1920s and 30s for class. But I think that for various forms of civil associations, initiatives, they can be picked up by whites. Some are immune to that. I don't see the right picking up feminism. I don't see the right being utilized and manipulating feminism to somebody actually disagrees even with that. And maybe that's wrong, but right now, it seems to me that their core constituencies are so masculinist and paternalistic that would be difficult, would create a kind of division. But in any case, we never knew. And what, of course, is what immunizes you or us is to become stronger on our side. So, you know, even though I'm not really a great fan of left populism, it could be that in some circumstances, left populism is the answer to the right-wing version. And in any case, we have to think about answers.
I think this actually tacks on nicely with Dan's question. I think one sort of awkward way of raising this subjective question today might be to ask, you know, what is the sort of theoretical intellectual work that intellectuals might be tasked with doing? And I think Professor Arato was sort of posing a really interesting challenge to the other panelists, and I think Ross, you were also saying something similar, that, you know, we need to sort of throw out the old dogmatic categories and sort of reconceptualize how we're thinking about the world and also how we're thinking about our ends. I mean, I guess the thrust of Dan's question, though, was even that impulse is itself a sort of dogma, a sort of repetition of something that's already failed. So I guess what would it mean to think in new categories? What would it mean to undertake original intellectual work today? And whether that's even possible.
I would say that you can't create new categories and new concepts without having mastered the old categories and the old concepts. You can't go about as if the history of the working class movement is of no importance and it's something you could simply ignore. So this search for new ways of thinking and new categories is, in my opinion, totally misplaced. Yes, we sometimes need to adopt new categories and new ways of thinking, but that means you have to have matured to a state where that becomes possible. I think for the most part, those on the left who talk in this way have not reached that state. They have basically thrown up their hands and have ignored that rich history that the working class movement has to offer.
Yeah, I view the task of theory as the self-critical reflection on practice, and hence revolutionary theory is the self-critical reflection on revolutionary practice. So in the absence of that, say for the last 100 years or so, I think we can't meaningfully advance upon the sort of revolutionary theories that were articulated by figures like Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Bourdieu, others. I think that the task of theory in non-revolutionary times is rather to preserve the critical insights of those who preceded us, to perhaps excavate those in a time such that, should a revolutionary movement again emerge, those insights can be brought to bear. I don't really view my own work as original in any sense.
If I could address this issue too, I think that the central dynamic, which I stress, is between what I call civil and political society. John Newsom and even Mamdani are political society in the United States. They are political actors that will be able to make decisions and will be able to fight, control some resources, including even some resources of violence. That's political society. Civil society is you. You may think of yourselves in this group or sitting in this room that you are part of a class. By just looking at you, even visually, I have serious doubts about that we all belong to somehow the same class. I don't see that. I don't see it, but it could be wrong. Maybe you all come from very wealthy families and families of successful intellectuals. I mean, it's possible. But just looking at you, I think you are not the same class. What I know is that you are actually, even this very thing you're doing in this room is participating in civil societies. And Platypus is an organization, it's not a party, it's not a social movement either, it's an initiative within civil society. I don't know too much about it, but the fact that you organize an event like this indicates that you are able to do things. And you could do much more, probably, because anybody who can do some can do more. So we are part of that. So here is the question that you just asked. What's the role of intellectuals or theorists in this relationship of civil and political between this group here and Zoran Mamdani in City Hall? Do we have a role, or should we just let it happen, then be played out without us? And I think you do have a role. That's something we inherited from Marx. I don't know if Marx himself has actually sourced the quotation, or Lenin did, that without revolutionary theory, there is no revolutionary praxis. I remember this slogan repeated over and over again in the days of the New Left in the 1960s and early 70s. Revolutionary theory is important. Radical theory, critical theory, these are important things. And who needs it? Well, I think that first and foremost is the actors of civil society who need it, and they might generate some of it themselves, but it's always good to bring in expertise and knowledge into that. And I think that the way the public sphere works, even politicians actually can be influenced by thought. It's not that they are immune once serious ideas are advanced. So I think there's a three-part relationship: civil, political, and intellectual. And one can be a member of both of these groups, or even all three. But I think these are all important functions, and intellectuals should not surrender that function, because we need to understand what we're in. We need to understand its dynamics, how it might change even a short period of time. And I think that that's an intellectual task.
I was going to just suggest is that one of the tasks of intellectuals is to learn something about pedagogy and to imagine what might good teaching and learning actually look like, no matter who it is that you're trying to engage with, but especially the proverbial workers. I think most intellectuals don't have a clue about how to do that. My friend Lauren, who, this is the book that I mentioned earlier, and Ross has copies to sell, and Dan was kind enough to do a blurb for the back, is that one of our many arguments was that whenever he gave a talk, he always wanted to start by making a presentation that would last 45 minutes. And I said, Lauren, I think you could do something differently. Like, for example, you could ask people who were in the room why they came. What did they know about the topic you were about to talk about? So you just didn't make lots of assumptions about what they needed to know and what they didn't know. I could never convince them of that. And that same thing was true for Noel Ignatieff, another revolutionary of that era who I just simply could not persuade ever to invest any effort in thinking about who in the world is understanding what it is you're saying and who is paying any attention. Those are important questions. And so it's not so much what the intellectual work that people should do, but rather if and when you have something worth saying, how you go about saying it or communicating it, whether it's saying it or writing or something like that. All those questions are very important.
Your time is basically up, so sorry for this is not going to have questions, but could we get closing thoughts for each of the panelists?
I'm out. Unfortunately, I have to leave, so that's why I'm out in part.
I'll just say thank you. It was an interesting panel. I think that there was some exchange of ideas, and there was also what Hegel called argumentation, where there was really no exchange of ideas, but simply one person was asserting what he believed to be the truth against another person who was asserting what he believed to be some other kind of truth. So that happens, and that's just the way it is.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I could add is that I think perhaps taking the question of subjectivity seriously, trying to reconstitute the working class as a subject of society and of history, we have to begin to take our own subjectivity seriously, question how we are reproducing our daily existence, what kinds of politics we strive towards, and how we can begin to make those possible. That's really, I think, the only task worth considering at the present, in the absence of an actual movement that can overthrow the current state of affairs.
Okay.
No more questions?
I'll answer whatever afterwards if you want.
Professor. Say something, and I can just say good wishes to everybody, and I hope that all of you experience within the near future some sign that your activity is not in vain, that things can actually change, and that you can do something. And I just wish everyone that you experience such a sign. I think that even the election of Mamdani could be understood as such a sign, but you don't have to agree with that, but look for your own sign. Thank you.
This book is for sale if anybody wants it, except for Noah, who gets a free copy.
If anybody wants the Goldner book,